Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on something you might be hearing a bit about lately. It's mycoplasma pneumonia infections. You sent over some CDC research on this and some of their findings. Well, they really caught my eye, let me tell you.
Yeah, it's definitely got public health circles talking.
Yeah.
Pneumonia itself isn't new.
Yeah.
It's a bacteria, not a virus. Causes respiratory illness, often presents kind of like a chest cold. But there are some unusual trends this year that have got everyone buzzing.
Yeah, I gotta say, when I saw walking pneumonia in the report, I was instantly hooked.
Catchy name, isn't it? And it really gets at one of the things that makes pneumonia so tricky. People can be infected and spreading it around without feeling completely knocked down. But before we get into all that, let's set the scene a bit. This CDC report, it's hot off the press from October 18th, 2024, and it's all about this recent uptick in cases.
Okay, so let's unpack this spike. The CDC mentions a significant rise in cases starting in late spring 2024. Emergency department visits for pneumonia diagnoses going up. What are we talking here percentage-wise?
Well, from late March to early October, the percentage of ER visits for pneumonia, where pneumonia was the culprit, it actually peaked in late August. So that's a pretty clear indicator that something's up.
Wow, so not just a little blip then. And here's the part that really got me. The CDC is showing this huge surge in infections among kids aged 2 to 4 years old, I always thought. This was more of a school-age thing.
You're right. Historically, it's been school-aged kids and young adults that are most affected. So this shift to younger children is definitely raising some eyebrows in the research community. There are a few theories floating around. Could be linked to changing daycare practices, waning immunity after the pandemic, or even a new strain of the bacteria. It's a bit of a puzzle right now, and scientists are working hard to put the pieces together.
That is fascinating.
Mhm.
And a little unnerving, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
especially for parents of toddlers like myself. Speaking of feeling a little uneasy, let's talk about this walking pneumonia thing.
Mm-hmm.
What does that actually mean? And how does it play into all of this?
So walking pneumonia basically means you have pneumonia caused by pneumonia, but your symptoms are milder than with other types of pneumonia. You might have a cough, feel tired, but you're still able to, go about your day, hence the walking part.
Makes sense. I had a friend go through something similar a few years ago. He had this nagging cough and low energy, but he just kept going to work thinking it was allergies. Turns out it was walking pneumonia all along. Talking about a delayed diagnosis.
Classic example. And that's why it can be so tricky, because people might not feel completely awful, they might not stay home, which means they could be spreading the bacteria without even realizing it. This could definitely be playing a role in the spike we're seeing.
Okay, so we've established that pneumonia infections can be deceptively mild. But what about the symptoms themselves? And what's the deal with those scarier complications mentioned in the report, like encephalitis?
Good point. While a lot of cases are like your friend's that walking pneumonia scenario, it's important to remember that pneumonia can cause a whole spectrum of symptoms. You might experience the usual suspects, cough, sore throat, fever, like with a common cold, but it can also get more serious.
Yeah, encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, definitely sounds like something you don't want to mess with.
Absolutely. It's a serious complication. And while most people will have a milder course, folks with weaker immune systems or existing respiratory conditions need to be extra cautious. Pneumonia can lead to severe pneumonia in those cases requiring hospitalization.
So definitely not something to take lightly, especially if you have any underlying health issues. Now, how does this bacteria actually spread? Is it like the flu or the common cold?
It is very much so. Think of it like a tiny ninja warrior traveling through those respiratory droplets. When an infected person coughs or sneezes, these droplets can hang in the air, land on surfaces, and potentially infect others.
So basically, any place where people gather, schools, offices, public transportation, it's a potential battleground for these ninja warriors.
Exactly. And the CDC report specifically calls out outbreaks in crowded settings like schools, dorms, nursing homes. And get this, the incubation period, the time between getting infected and showing symptoms. It's surprisingly long for pneumonia, 1 to 4 weeks.
Oh, wow. So you could be spreading it for weeks without even knowing. That's unsettling.
It is. And here's another tricky bit. The bacteria can actually hang out in your respiratory tract for months, meaning you could be contagious for quite a while.
Okay, so let's say you start feeling those symptoms. How do you even know if it's pneumonia? What's that diagnosis process like?
Well, that's where things can get a little complicated. Often doctors will use what's called a respiratory panel, which tests for a bunch of different pathogens at once, flu, RSV, COVID-19, other viruses, and bacteria. The challenge is pneumonia often looks like other respiratory illnesses, so it's hard to pin down right away.
So it's not like a simple, yep, that's definitely pneumonia kind of diagnosis.
Yeah. Not always. Doctors often have to play detective, looking at your symptoms, your medical history, the lab results to piece together the puzzle. They might even order a chest x-ray if they suspect pneumonia.
Got it. So it's a bit of a process.
Yeah.
And what happens if it is pneumonia? Is it like other bacterial infections where you just pop some antibiotics and you're good to go?
Well, here's where things get a little more complicated. Pneumonia has this kind of sneaky defense mechanism. It's naturally resistant to some common antibiotics like penicillin, which are often used to treat other types of bacterial pneumonia.
Hold on. So the usual go-to antibiotics won't work.
Not necessarily. There are specific antibiotics called macrolides, like azithromycin. These are typically the first line of defense against pneumonia. But even with those, there's growing concern about antibiotic resistance.
Aye, antibiotic resistance. That's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
It is, and it's something the CDC is keeping a close eye on. Macrolide-resistant strains of pneumonia are becoming more and more common, which could make treatment a lot tougher down the road.
Okay, so this is where I start to get a little worried. We've got this bacteria on the rise. It's tricky to diagnose. And there's this looming threat of antibiotic resistance. What can we do to protect ourselves?
Well, first and foremost, the same preventative measures that work against other respiratory illnesses. They're your best weapons against pneumonia as well.
You're talking the classics, hand washing, covering those coughs and sneezes, staying home when you're feeling under the weather.
Exactly. Think of them as your superhero moves against the spread of germs. Simple, but incredibly effective. And of course, if you have any concerns or are experiencing symptoms that just won't quit, always consult with your healthcare provider.
Great advice. So basically, knowledge is power here. The more we understand about pneumonia, the better prepared we are. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive so far. I'm ready to learn more.
Me too. Let's keep exploring.
As I was reading through this CDC report, one thing that really jumped out at me was how much they emphasize the challenges that healthcare providers face when it comes to accurately diagnosing and treating these pneumonia infections. It's almost like they're sending up a flare saying, hey, this isn't always a slam dunk.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a whole section in there dedicated to outlining those very hurdles. It's a refreshing dose of honesty, I think. Acknowledging that, this isn't always a clear-cut case. One of the first things they point out is that the symptoms of pneumonia can be so similar to other respiratory infections. It's like trying to pick out a specific bird in a flock just by its chirp.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. It's easy to mistake it for a cold, the flu, even COVID-19, all those usual suspects.
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky. If a doctor thinks it's just a viral infection, they might not even think about testing for pneumonia specifically.
Which is a problem because, as we know, some of those common antibiotics just don't work against it. So getting that right diagnosis early on can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And the CDC report actually pointed out something I thought was really interesting. They suggested that the prolonged period of low pneumonia incidence we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic might have actually muddied the waters further.
Huh. That's an interesting point. How so?
Well, think about it. For a couple of years there, pneumonia infections were relatively rare. So it's possible that some healthcare providers, especially those who, started practicing during that time, they might not have as much experience recognizing and diagnosing it. It's kind of like if you're a mechanic and suddenly everyone starts driving electric cars, you got to adapt your skills.
I see what you mean. The less you encounter something, the harder it can be to spot it.
Exactly. On top of that, the report also brings up the issue of the limited availability or use of diagnostic tools in certain areas.
So even if a doctor suspects pneumonia, they might not have easy access to the tests needed to confirm it.
That's a possibility, especially in places with fewer resources. And even when those tests are available, they're not always foolproof.
It sounds like diagnosing pneumonia can be a bit of a detective story. You really have to gather all the clues and put the pieces together.
That's a great analogy. And the report really stresses that because of this complexity, it's even more crucial for healthcare providers to be vigilant. They need to keep pneumonia in mind as a possible culprit, especially when patients aren't responding as expected to those standard antibiotic treatments.
It's a good reminder that sometimes you got to think outside the box.
Yeah,
And consider those less common diagnoses. Not every cough is just a cough, right?
absolutely. Speaking of thinking outside the box, there's another aspect of the report I found fascinating: their emphasis on monitoring for antibiotic resistance.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly before. What has the CDC so concerned about it?
Well, remember how we were talking about macrolides being the usual go-to for treating pneumonia?
Right, azithromycin and those types of antibiotics?
The problem is that bacteria are incredibly adaptable. They can actually evolve and develop ways to resist the effects of those antibiotics. It's like this microscopic arms race. And unfortunately, we're seeing this rise in macrolide resistance in pneumonia, which is a worrying trend.
So what happens if those usual antibiotics stop working? What are the implications for patients?
That's the million-dollar question, and the CDC report actually lays out some potential consequences. If macrolide resistance becomes widespread, it could severely limit our treatment options. For pneumonia infections, it's like having a flat tire and realizing your spare is also flat.
And that could lead to more severe cases, longer illnesses, potentially even more hospitalization.
Exactly. It's a scenario we definitely want to avoid. That's why the CDC is really urging healthcare providers to be mindful about antibiotic use, prescribing them only when they're truly necessary. It's about being good stewards of these precious resources.
So it's not about just throwing antibiotics at every sniffle,
Yeah.
but being really strategic about when and how they're used.
Precisely. The goal is to prevent bacteria from developing resistance in the first place. It's a preventative approach rather than just reacting when things get bad. And the CDC is also investing in research to track those resistant strains as they emerge and to develop new treatment strategies.
But it sounds like they're taking this threat seriously.
They are, and they're encouraging everyone to do their part in preventing antibiotic resistance. It's a team effort, really.
Okay, so what can we as individuals do to help? Besides, of course, following those preventative measures we talked about, like washing our hands and staying home when we're sick.
Those are fantastic starting points. Another crucial step is to only take antibiotics when they're prescribed by a healthcare provider, and to complete the full course of treatment as directed, even if you start feeling better before you've finished all those pills.
Right. I've heard that stopping antibiotics early can actually contribute to that resistance developing. It's like giving the bacteria a chance to study the playbook and figure out how to beat the defense.
That's a great way to put it. It allows those tougher bacteria to survive and multiply, potentially leading to more resistant strains. By completing the full course, you make sure those bacteria are completely wiped out, reducing the risk of resistance developing.
So these seemingly small actions can actually have a ripple effect on public health in the long run.
Absolutely. And it all circles back to being informed and taking a proactive approach to our health.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's a reminder that even common illnesses can have these complex layers. And staying informed is half the battle.
I agree. And it really highlights how our individual actions can impact the health of our communities. We're all connected in this intricate web of well-being.
I like that. An intricate web of well-being.